When we think of France in the Great War, the first rifle that comes to mind is the Lebel. However, much like the US 1917, by the end of the conflict their primary shoulder arm would be their previous second standard. Hi, I'm Othais, and this is a Mousqueton Model 1892 and artillery Berthier, at least for a little while, but we'll get into that whole story after we get this guy in for a closer look in the light box. With an overall length of 37.2 inches and weighing in at 6.8 pounds, this is a handy little darling and conveniently loads with the Mannlicher style end block clip. However, it only has a capacity of 3 rounds, and all 3 of them are 8x50 Lebel. Dear fans, you are not suffering from deja vu. You have seen the Berthier before, long ago, and honestly not our best piece of work because we've learned a lot more in the intervening years, and so we are going to bring this guy back out and give it the proper history it deserves. Now, the success story of the Berthier is inseparable from the failure of the Lebel, and so I've made sure to have one of those right here. We've already done a lovely updated episode on this, the world's first smokeless powdered small bore military repeating rifle, one that sparked a global rearmament panic. Being revolutionary, however, does not always mean being the best. Early adopters of new technology often find that they missed out in the rush to adopt the Lebel. French officials had latched onto their current magazine repeater, which was a hybrid of their existing Gras and the imported Kropatschek magazine system. This was a fair choice at the time, as the Kropatschek tubular magazine was a proven military repeating system. As a matter of fact, let's quickly take a look at how this might work on the Lebel. Alright gang, we've seen this particular rifle before, so I just want to talk a little bit about how weird the magazine can get. So let's take a look inside. I'm going to pop this guy open, and if we were working from blank, let's say we're here, okay? We've got an elevator that we're going to need to depress, and then ideally we would load up our 8 rounds, throw one on that elevator, and then to feed the one from the elevator, we would have to snap back and then push forward, and then boom, we're in business. And the gun starts running like it should. But I want to show you how easy it is to get out of index with this thing. So let's start here for a moment and pretend we've expended our last round. We've grabbed for a handful of ammo, we dropped it on the ground, we've only got 3 rounds because I don't want this to last an hour. But we have less than the ideal number of rounds. All right, out of habit, what we're gonna do is we're gonna throw that elevator down, and we're gonna throw in our first round. We're gonna throw in our second round. If I can get it to, actually, there we go. We're gonna throw in our third round, not remembering to leave it on that elevator. So, that's already a challenge. We haven't put one on the elevator, so then we're gonna go, okay, well I don't have one on the elevator, so I'm gonna dry cycle this action in order to get one onto the elevator, right? That didn't do anything. We must first raise the elevator by yanking backwards. Then we can dry cycle it forwards, then come back and have picked up one on the elevator. Now we can feed it into the, okay, so you can see where I'm going with this. This gun leaves you in a position where you may have to carry the one in the middle of a firefight, and that is extremely distracting. Okay, so it definitely gets the job done, and again, perfectly modern for the period, but it didn't work so well on horseback, which was important because France had a very strong emphasis on cavalry tactics and relied on a fast and aggressive strategy carried out by armed men on horses. At the time of the Lebel's adoption, they were using a single-shot black powder centerfire carbine, which was really only slightly shorter than the infantry rifle, and of course, their usual swords. So when the French start trying out a Lebel carbine, well, they get into some trouble. Let's start with the good. If you leave the magazine cutoff on, the Lebel is just about the same as that previous Gras in terms of handling. However, a Lebel cavalry carbine would be a fair bit heavier thanks to the larger all steel receiver and the steel magazine tube and spring and everything down at the front of the gun, all extending forward and throwing off the balance, especially when loaded. Also, we just saw the label is a bit difficult to reload, so there would be no great gain in overall fire rate for the cost of all that weight. Again, just to point this out, without a loading tool of some sort, the fire rate of a rifleman with a magazine rifle could only be sped up over a limited time, as singularly loading and firing 8 rounds versus manually loading up 8 rounds at once and then firing all of them is roughly the same amount of overall time, which means taken en masse, there is a very limited benefit to a magazine rifle without some sort of rapid loading device. Ordnance at the time may also have worried about chain detonation. This is a concept that centerfire cartridges resting, tip to primer in a tubular magazine may cause an out-of-battery detonation if jostled too hard. Now, there is a lot of argument and debate out there on this matter, but I'll point out 3 things here. 1, the martial use of tubular magazines was still fairly new, so people might worry about vague possibilities because they don't have the experience to see if it's really going to happen or not. 2, on extremely rare occasions, we do see ordnance reports of these sorts of detonations. So while statistically almost insignificant, it did at least happen a couple of times in a handful of armies. And 3, there is evidence the French were indeed worried about this possibility, and it's written right on the 8mm Lebel cartridge. The original 1886 cartridge would quickly give way to the slightly improved Ball M that I show here. Essentially the previous Gras black powder cartridge necked down awkwardly to 8mm, named for its Malicord jacket, in turn named for the inventors Malot and Chauret. This smokeless powder round sports a unique flat-tipped bullet, one I have been told was adopted out of the ever so slight worry about that chain detonation. And if you're worried about that sort of thing, you're probably more concerned when you put it on horseback, bouncing along a bit more harshly than infantry on the march. So weight, balance, maybe chain detonation? Well, what else? Well, the Lebel had just about the least cartridge feed control. Okay, we're back to our Lebel with 1 fake round in the chamber, and let's talk about what other problems we can have. So I go to kick this guy out. Oop, I should have been a little more authoritative, but these plastic snap caps are slowly degrading. All right, that's already a nice feed problem, isn't it? Let's get that guy out of there and pretend that he ejected cleanly. Now, I want to feed my little yellow guy down there, right? When she comes up, see, there's a lot of waggle. And the only thing really holding it in place are these 2 little lips back here, which assumes that I'm holding the rifle with the buttstock slightly downwards, keeping everything sort of behaving. But if I'm a little bit forward, like muzzle down, because I'm doing, I don't know, I'm shooting downwards, I'm in a high position, whatever. If this manages to rock a little bit forwards, and then I'm not necessarily vertical, well, she certainly comes out nice and easy. And if you're bouncing around on a horse, not that you should really be firing from the horse's back, but you're trying to feed the rifle from the horse up and down, all directions, it'd be very easy to kick out around. And then we're back to that system where we have to dry cycle the gun in order to get the next cartridge, at which point maybe it goes flying off into the ether because I'm holding it at the wrong angle. Cavalry are not going to be into this. They have to be moving and fighting very aggressively in smaller numbers against larger forces very often. They don't want to have to think about what their rifle is doing. They want to just work the bolt and keep shooting. Basically, the Kropatschek magazine as fitted on the Lebel wasn't super great for cavalry. Interestingly, a solution for all of this was being developed and adopted in nearby Austria at the same time as the French were working on this rifle here. As seen on the Austrian 1886 rifle, Ferdinand Mannlicher's clip system allowed not only rapid loading, but an overall increase in rate of fire. Unlike the single-loading Lebel, a Mannlicher clip can be preloaded with multiple rounds, and the whole packet shoved into the gun at one time with a singular hand movement. That means the loading time is actually sped up, and not only does the rate of fire increase, but the downtime between loading the gun, well, that's decreased. Luckily, at least one French engineer noticed all of this. André Virgile Paul-Marie Berthier. Born in January of 1858 in Neuilly-sur-Seine, he would join the army in 1876, rising to the rank of sergeant in the 2nd Zouaves, and lieutenant in the 44th Territorial Infantry. Information is sparse, but it appears Berthier moved to the reserves. His civilian career progressed as a railway engineer and was combined with a love of shooting, as he's listed in the organizational registers of French shooting clubs and national competition organizers. And I believe he had designed some sub-caliber conversions for military small arms. When a French cavalry rifle committee under General de Galifet started looking for a carbine weighing, well, less than this, and also they named a number, less than 3.6 kilograms. Well, in 1887, the Poteau Arsenal would put forward a design by our Monsieur Berthier. His initial gun was simply a modification of the Lebel, now running from a 4-round clip. Like the Mannlicher, this was one directional with a top and bottom. It's interesting to note that this was marketed not only as a carbine, but as a conversion system for the existing infantry Lebels, despite having just been adopted, really. Ultimately, the first Lebel Berthier was too heavy for cavalry use, and so Poteau and Berthier would head back to the drawing board, returning the next year with an improved model. This was actually a 5-shot variation, which still sports the Lebel-style receiver, but with a distended metal projection to provide enough room for the extra cartridges and provide reliable feeding. That gun fared a lot better and saw some limited trials production alongside a carbine from l'École Normale de Tir, who fielded a shortened Lebel of their own weird sort, and it proved a little heavier and harder to use. And another carbine that was done by Saint-Étienne, although I'm actually unsure of its configuration because it seems to have failed to impress enough to really be as well documented as the others. So the Berthier gun became the focus of development, and in a series of abusive tests, sustained fire, rust, sand, defective cartridges, the stuff we're used to, one problem came to light, which is that magazine extension was kind of a pain. Since the gun was being designed to be as compact as possible and to be carried on the backs of cavalrymen, well, you don't really want to have any distended metal sticking out. Although we do see this sort of thing on period Mannlichers, German Carabiner 88s, and the Italian Carcano carbine. These metal projections would be vulnerable to damage, possibly irritate a rider, and less importantly but still annoying, they tended to beat up on the uniforms. We'll actually see the Dutch address this in a different way in another episode. So in order to keep a compact, flush magazine, Poteau and the Cavalry Committee opted for a 3-round clip. To the cavalry at the time coming from a single-shot Gras, this was a 300% increase in magazine capacity, and overall provided a higher rate of fire than the standard infantry rifle. Honestly, as much as we might laugh at the idea of a 3-round magazine, it doesn't seem they really felt the pinch of it until the Great War, but we'll see that later. So with a 3-shot clip and reverting to a Gras-like full stock, the cavalry now had, well, something a lot like this, an extremely light carbine that they could put to work easily within their existing drill and tactics. And so, not quite this was adopted in 1890, but before we get into all the variations, let's get a look at the mechanism that will be applied to all of the Berthiers, with one of our good old animations.
First, we'll load our 3-round M-block clip, which snags on a hook at the rear of the magwell, keeping it from springing back out of the top. This can be manually released at any time if desired, thanks to a projection in the trigger guard. Note, the clip has now become the feed lips for the carbine. This means it's not only a loading device, but a functional component of the magazine. Both the clip catch and the sear are powered by the same singular V-spring. The bolt is the same design as the Lebel, with a separate rotating head making for easier maintenance. The same cock-on-open cocking piece also comes over, attached directly to the firing pin. Returning to the magazine, note the follower assembly. 2 arms powered by 2 flat springs. These press the cartridges upwards and fit between the lips of the M-block clip, so that as the final round feeds, the clip now falls free and out of the action. With our last round, let's look at the trigger with its double hump rear shape giving a 2-stage pull. Alright, back to the history lesson.
Now, I know it's a little bit unusual in this show for us to have shown the animated internals before the gun itself, but this guy is just one of many designs, and the differences are all in the fittings, not in the internals. So with that common base now understood, let's count the differences, starting of course with that cavalry model of 1890. More properly, Carabine de Cavalerie Modèle 1890. Only 37.4 inches in length and weighing just 6.6 pounds, this is an extremely handy cavalry gun. And because of their use of the saber, this gun has no provision for a bayonet. It does, however, have a full clearing rod, which we'll discuss in just a moment. Initially, this 1890 cavalry carbine was issued to the Metropolitan Light Infantry, who would soon find them somewhat annoying thanks to the sling positions. Initially underslung at the rear and with a ring on the left side of the barrel band, this proved uncomfortable for riders. And so in 1895, production shifted to a left side sling bar and a fixed loop on the barrel band. While only affecting new production, years later nearly all would be updated to this pattern. Production would be taken up by the arsenals of Châtellerault and Saint-Étienne, with the majority being completed in the first 2 years, though Saint-Étienne would have a trickle of supply through 1905, so roughly 200,000 in total. Also in 1905, the cavalry model would be approved for use by military supply transportation squadrons. Alright, that covers most of the cavalry, and I say most because France still had their own special heavy cavalry all the way into the Great War. These were the cuirassiers, who had previously in French history had a unique, heavily armored cavalry role, but thanks to the development in small arms technology, these shiny cuirasses were no longer very effective in warfare. But tradition and institutional momentum win their own battles in peacetime. Two issues arise with using a standard cavalry Berthier when you are a cuirassier. First, shouldering a metal butt plate on a metal breastplate is not super secure, especially with the harsh recoil of a carbine shooting a full power 8mm Lebel cartridge. Also, it might ruin the polish. Secondly, those helmets have really thick cheek straps which make getting your head behind the sight just a little bit impossible, which is why the Carabine de Cuirassier Modèle 1890 looks like this, with a hard leather butt plate preventing slipping and scratching, and no stock comb allowing a helmeted head to find the rear sight. These of course saw very limited production, with only 20,000 made by Châtellerault, which was fine because they were exclusively issued to the Metropolitan French Heavy Cavalry. Now, the next units to need a carbine wouldn't exactly be in the army. Instead, it's time to visit the gendarmerie, a sort of national militarized police. Adopted in 1892, the Carabine de Gendarmerie is still a Modèle 1890. While identical to the cavalry model in nearly every way, it has one clear distinction in that it does have a bayonet mount. This was a Lebel-like cruciform fitted to a unique locking lug at the end of the stock. Production was again done at both Châtellerault and Saint-Étienne with a combined total of just over 80,000, though there was some excess production which would be immediately converted into a new pattern for the artillery. And that is actually the gun I have here today, that Mousqueton d'Artillerie Modèle 1892. Field artillery at this point was in a weird place. We see nations trying a variety of solutions, and France was no exception. Usually a carbine would turn out to be the answer, but as we have seen, other nations would consider swords, revolvers, dedicated pistols. Most famously, Germany would start on an artillery Luger just before the war, but that's a good 2 decades ahead of our gun today. French artillery needed a light, portable carbine that they could keep around, but largely out of their way until needed. And so in August of 1892, this Berthier configuration was adopted, the Mousqueton d'Artillerie Modèle 1892. So let's get a closer look. All right, gang, we got a dandy little carbine. Let's start at the front. We've got front sight, hey, we've got our bayonet lug and forward barrel band. And then if I flip her over, you can see we have a clearing rod, not a cleaning rod. There's no hole in this. This was because of the unreliability of early metallic cartridge. Stuck cases were fairly frequent. This also doesn't have, you know, the super cool Mauser extractor. So you could use this to knock out a spent case if you really couldn't get a hold of it. Now, if we work our way down, we'll see our sling swivel, in this case, a big old ring. This would have been on the cavalry 1890 right from the beginning, but the cavalry didn't like it. They switched over to a solid bar. At the rear, again, the early 1890s would have had this same lower sling swivel, but the cavalry didn't like it and they went to a solid bar. However, all the other models of 1890 and this 1892 kept this system, so we can see what a cavalry would have looked like in that regard. From there, we have our rear sight, which is a combination of tangent and ladder. I'm actually going to show you more of that later on the episode, so hold your breath there for a second. If we come on back though, we see we are dealing with a one-piece stock unlike the Lebel, and we have 2 reinforcers to help out with that. We also have some extension of this receiver down into this area here. We have a very flat looking trigger. We have, well, I'll show you that in a second. Let's get to the bolt. This is the Lebel bolt. It's just been extended and turned down. And this is an early one that has not been modified because, as we can see, we have 2 serrations here. These are both the positions for the cocking piece because this particular gun, again, set up for, well, really more for bad ammo than for safety. A half-cock safety is perfectly normal in the Americas, but in the French system, it was actually more for this. We fire the gun, we have a bit of a dud, maybe the primer didn't get hit quite right or whatever. We want to restrike it without opening up the gun. So we're going to manually recock this, which is why we have this finger rest here. To do so, though, we have to overcome a very strong spring, and it's a fairly long distance. And if we were to get tired 90% of the way there and slip our thumb, we might end up with a discharge that we were not expecting. That is very dangerous. So by putting that half cock there, if you're on your way back to full cock and you goof up, well, now you're in this neutral position where even if it falls, it's really not enough force to strike that primer and necessarily detonate the gun. Obviously, as you saw, it's not a safety because you can fire from the half cock. The full cock is all the way back here. Oh, there. And if you can imagine, if I had dropped that 9/10 of the way and it had fallen all the way to the bottom, we definitely would have had a cartridge going off negligent discharge. So this is a good safety only in the regards of you manually cocking this and not dropping it all the way down. It does not actually protect you from firing the gun. This feature would actually be abandoned as ammo got better, and so you'll see only 1 notch on later made ones, or any guns that came in and had their cocking pieces replaced would have been replaced with a 1-notch cocking piece. Now, all that said, I should probably show you the loading system, which is a 3-shot, look at that, it's adorable, en-bloc clip, right? So obviously my plastic dummies again. Unlike the Lebel, and I want to be clear about this, the Lebel, you load 1 round, you fire 1 round, or you load 1 round, you load 2 round, you load 3 round, I'm not even counting 3 round, 4 round, 5 round. Every cartridge goes in singularly and then is fired singularly. So there's not a huge difference between, you know, firing 1 shot at a time or loading the whole magazine and shooting the whole magazine. In this case though, we've taken the action of loading and we've tripled it. We're now getting 3 rounds. So I do 1 action to stick this in here and push down, which is actually faster than loading a single round in the Lebel anyway. Now, in that 1 motion, I have now put 3 rounds into the system. We have sped up our loading and firing significantly. I know it doesn't seem like a lot because we're used to 5, 10, whatever, but 3 was still way better than the previous existing system, and it kept the gun nice and light and nice and reinforced where there's nothing to get banged or beat on. Okay, so if we want to get this out without firing it, we do have a button here. We can give it a little depress, push the button, she'll pop right on out. If we had expended all of our ammo, like we saw in our animation, the clip is then unsupported, and at which point, here, let's put 1 dummy in there. There we go, I'll do a partial load. So once that last dummy feeds, you can see this guy is already ready to come out, and I haven't even let gravity do its job. So once she's unsupported by cartridges, falls out the bottom. That same bottom becomes a bit of a vulnerability in the Great War though, because lots of things can get in there. Ultimately, aside from the name and the bayonet, this gun is identical to the 1890 Gendarmerie, so you really get an easy 2-for-1. And this little guy right here will stand in for all of the 3-shot carbines as Mae takes it out to the range. Yeah, this is probably the loudest dang gun in the entire series. The 1892 we have here was also a perfect gun to use for demonstration because it would be the most common pre-war French carbine by a country mile. Production was undertaken by Chassepot and Saint-Étienne. Surprise, surprise. If we count all the 92s made up until 1918, we get somewhere in the ballpark of 730,000 total guns, dwarfing all other models I've listed so far. This is because the 1892 became a general purpose weapon, eventually being issued to engineers, drivers, couriers, and with the emergence of the machine gun, well, there was even more demand for this carbine. Also at this point, I'm sure some of you are confused because this is named the Mousqueton 1892 and I keep saying carbine. Well, that's another point where tradition wins out again. Going back to the previous Grand, this is the cavalry carbine with a 27.6 inch barrel, and this is the artillery Mousqueton with a 20.1 inch barrel. Now, looking at these, you would think that a Mousqueton is always going to be shorter than a carbine. But really, in French nomenclature of the time, both were just shortened rifles. And the difference is entirely in the habitual use of language. In the French military, again of that time, a carabine was for a soldier on horseback and a Mousqueton went with a soldier on foot. Alright, so the French have a carbine, well, multiple carbines, and a Mousqueton. Well, now what? Well, as with most early smokeless guns, we're going to see various updates, and one of the most unique will be undertaken with the introduction of a new cartridge in 1898. That would be Ball D. Some say it was named for its inventor, Captain Dessalot, but evidence says that it was the fourth of 5 experimental cartridges and was alphabetized accordingly. Designed for aerodynamics, this was an early Spitzer bullet with a boat tail rear and was milled from solid brass. Well, majority brass alloy. The Ball D was much faster and flatter shooting and thus demanded a change in rifle sights. Now, we've seen the rear sight changed out for new ammunition before, but the French were still sitting on a lot of Ball M, so they weren't eager to make their guns incompatible with their massive reserve of ammunition. Instead, they'd work up a new rear sight that could shoot either cartridge correctly, if you know what you're doing. Alright, I promised you a closer look at this guy, and we are here now. So, we have a tangent stack, which means I can adjust this little leaf and then set her down, and look, we're sitting up a little prouder. This gives us some range markings on up until, I believe, let me see what it says on this guy. Ooh, 1,000 meters of tangent possibilities. And then if I flip her all the way over, you wouldn't do this on this particular carbine, but I can so I can show the camera. We've got some markings. These are our long range markings as a ladder. So if I wanted to set this to something ludicrous high, like, I don't know, 1,800 meters, then as the shooter, you would leave it in the 90-degree position, look at it this way, and that'd be your volley fire. Now, this particular setup works for both cartridges because these two tangent stacks, these stair steps, they're actually slightly different heights. It's very hard to see on camera, but you can see it more easily in that this thing does indeed rest level. So you can see our actual ladder rests right up on this thing. It's not canted in any way. And yet, if we look at the underside of our leaf, I've got a solid bar here and a notch here. And that notch is the difference in height between these two stair steps. And there's a reason for that. Because currently, this is set for using the lower stair steps, the right-hand side, and therefore it is set for the faster moving, flatter shooting Spitzer cartridge. If I were to be issued the earlier, lob cartridge, the one that has a little bit more arc to it and needs these higher stair steps, well then what I could do is I could flip this guy over and I could take a screwdriver and remove that screw, pull this off, flip it 180 degrees, put it back on, screw that back in, and now it would sit a little prouder on all my tangent settings, and I would be correct for that earlier cartridge, which is a great an honestly fantastic way of making sure that you have some reverse compatibility while also being able to adopt a new cartridge. It's the first I've seen of it in terms of military service. Now, just for clarification, I want to point out that pure Ball D would not be the official cartridge for the Great War. Instead, in 1912, we'll see another modification. Ball D-AM, meaning amorçage modifié, modified priming. Ball D had introduced a ring around the primer to help further prevent chain detonation with that new pointy bullet. Well, that wasn't perfectly executed, and especially with machine gun loads, some primers were failing during firing. So the ring was pushed out wider, reinforcing the primer and providing the same safe space for the bullet. That change did not, however, require modifying the sights in any meaningful way. There were actually some other pre-war modifications of these guns, but they came about because of the introduction of full-sized rifle variants of the Berthier. And beyond that, we will have to talk about the mid-war upgrade to the entire Berthier family. However, those stories will have to wait until next episode, but that doesn't mean I can't tell you about two little updates that happened after war were declared. And because of the war, the Berthier would have a growing influence, but we're only here for the 3-shot carbines right at this particular moment. First off, in July of 1915, orders would go out to convert any existing cavalry carbines into the artillery pattern. That means fitting them with a bayonet lug. This makes original 1890s fairly rare, though I'm unsure how many were actually converted under these orders. The second change revolved around the cuirassiers, who were still an active cavalry force at the start of World War I. Now I know what you're thinking, heavy Napoleonic armor and horses wouldn't be the best idea in the sort of machine gun-laden Great War. And you would be absolutely right, but it took the French a little bit to realize that. Initially, they were fielded as was, though they did get to put a cloth cover over those shiny cuirasses so that they weren't, like a mirror. This proved out to be a bad idea. Curiously, it seems the horses fell out of favor faster than the armor. Honestly, this is probably because dismounted fighting was taking up more and more of their time as the fighting lines became more static. So the first order to go out was just like the 1890 cavalry, they would need a bayonet. However, instead of converting the few existing cuirassier carbines, these were just reissued to units that did not need a bayonet at all and were kind of unlikely to need a gun, like drivers. And the cuirassier would get the 1892 artillery carbines like pictured here, which is all well and good until you have to put back on that cuirass. So they started to add the butt pad from the 1890 cuirassier model to the 1892s, and at some point someone realized while they were at all this that they still had those helmets and they would need to fix the stocks, which is when things finally came full circle and they realized we should have just put the bayonet lugs on the original cuirassier carbines. So they settled on doing that, briefly. Because right after, the cuirassiers were kicked off their horses, at which point they were fancy infantry and could just field a normal 1892 carbine with no modifications needed. Which is why most of the 1890 cuirassier carbines would eventually be made into 1892 pattern artillery carbines, making them the rarest of the Berthier variants and probably the dizziest. Okay. I think we can rest here for a moment now and take some time to get Mae's opinion on, well, the Model 1892 specifically, but overall the 3-shot Berthier as a concept. All right, once more I made room for Mae, and we don't need a ton of room for this little guy, so
not really.
Let me hand that over.
Thank you.
Now the Berthier it's an interesting rifle. It is among some of the earlier designs that was still kicking around for World War I. Because if you think about it, 1890, really, because this is the 1892 version, but 1890, that's when this thing was settled on.
Sure.
Very new clip technology at that time. First of the smokeless
Fancy
powder cartridges, you know what I mean? right behind the label.
Yeah, so this was the alt to the label, essentially.
Right, so this thing has a lot more in common with those Kropatschek era guns.
Okay.
Or like the Mannlicher straight pulls with the wedge lockers that we saw, like the 1886 through the 1890.
Sure.
It's much more in line with those than even just a few years later where we start to see, Mannlicher 1895s, and especially as the century starts to turn, we see things like Mannlicher Schronauers, and then we really see like the Mauser Model 98, and that tends to be what people think as the bolt-action rifle.
Okay.
So as much as we want to think of this as a World War I gun because it was a mainline World War I rifle, carbine in this case, it dates back much further than we think. Right. This is one of those cases where somebody held on to one longer than the other people held on to it. So in that mindset, what do you feel when you pick this up? What are the ergonomics like?
Yeah, I mean, it does feel kind of dated, but let's work this from the ground up. I really want to give this just a review from there. So obviously, very short, and surprisingly, it feels like it should be, just by looking at it, heavier than what it is, but it's actually pretty light.
No, the Berthier looks dense, and then you get it in your hand and you realize how much of it is hollow. I
think it's just because of the bulkiness right here in the center with the receiver. It feels like there should be a lot more weight here, and there really just isn't, which, I mean, not too bad, at least ergonomically from the start.
Right, how's that balance? Where's the weight at in the gun?
So that's what's interesting, and I guess it does seem like it's kind of obvious. It does have more weight to the rear, so it almost feels like you want to put your hand, right there, where the magazine injection port down there is. Like, it feels like that's the perfect spot for it. But of course, you're not going to put your hand there. But, more weight to the rear, not too bad. It's still, you can put it up against your shoulder and hold it in tight. That's not bad.
Having it right over the magazine actually makes a lot of sense if you think about it from the French perspective, where they were coming from the lapel and they had a shifting balance point depending on how loaded or unloaded that magazine tube was. Mm-hmm. So if you have the balance point directly in line with the cartridges, loaded or unloaded, that carbine has exactly the same balance.
Which that I'm okay with. The label made that a little bit difficult as time went on the range. But no, at least the balance on this one, you really don't feel the change as you're losing rounds. Of course, I've only got 3, but we're going to get more into that in just a moment.
Okay.
Okay, so obviously lighter carbine, also no semi-pistol grip.
Straight wrist.
Unfortunately, but there's only so much you can do with that, I suppose. Getting more into the action, turn down bolt here, which the length on it, I kind of like. It's just too bad that it didn't have something like a dog leg or something to it, because it deposits your hand so low here that I feel like if the trigger were right here, just a little further forward, or if the actual bolt handle swept back a little bit, it deposits you closer to the trigger, which would be really nice.
Yeah.
They did actually mill a little bit of metal out here too in the bolt handle. I did notice that, which was, I thought, pretty good. You still, unfortunately, it kind of does pinch your finger and you do kind of have to wedge your hand in there. So they did some help there, but just not enough. So I'd probably maybe do a little bit of the wood, take a little bit of the wood out there.
Unfortunately, you're going to spend a lot more time riding with something like this, or in the artillery case like this one, you're going to spend a lot more time sort of humping it around somewhere.
Which, I mean, for riding, I can see how this would be a good thing. Like, it's swept down here, it's really right up against the gun, so you're really not going to snag it very easily.
It'd be pretty hard to accidentally get something up under there, but I will say with that length and that 90-degree angle, if you actually did get something under there by accident, that's going to grab hold.
Oh, yeah, it's going to jerk you real good.
Yeah, and now these don't have any sort of
safety?
But the safety's always lock the breech. Mm-hmm. And so these don't have any of that. So there's no, even that half cock we were talking about.
Yeah.
It's not a safety. I mean, it's a safety in the sense of when you go to full cock and you drop it, it's not going to set off around by accident. But you can still pull the trigger like you saw. But the interesting thing is other countries, a lot of times, especially with, moving with the rifles, the safeties lock the action shut so that you don't bonk it open when you're riding or walking.
Makes
in this case, you don't have that protection. Instead, they've kept it low to the stock and put it down real long, so it's really unlikely to get tipped at all.
So, like, the lack of a safety kind of makes me get back to that old school kind of feeling with the older rifles, where it's like, they didn't really need the safety for this one, and I kind of get it, but it kind of makes me think on some of the older one-shot rifles where it's like it's not 100% necessary.
Yeah, but even those tended to have some sort of lockout mechanism.
That's true.
Which would provide the combination of being able to carry one in the chamber with a safety and, again, like I said, keep you from opening the bolt. The French doctrine's entirely different. The French doctrine was, you might keep the magazine loaded, but you did not keep around in the chamber. And in some ways, it's tended to be how we think of things now. It's actually almost an advanced concept, because most people who do modern concealed carry or something like that, they keep alive around the chamber and they don't like manual safeties. Instead, they prefer, sear blocks and sort of mechanical safeties, but ultimately, if they go and pull on that trigger, it's going to go boom, and they want that. They want no real thought about it. Mm-hmm. You can kind of respect that now in hindsight. However, every other nation on the planet went with a manual safety except for France. So it makes the Berthier truly unique along with the Lebel.
Yeah. Other than that, feature-wise, we're just looking at basically a clearing rod tucked off to the side. I kind of like that they took some of the wood out here and just stuck it off to the side. It's not in my way in any way. Not too bad. And the only other thing I really noticed, we don't really get into the sling swivels, but dang, these guys were rattling. This one in particular was just rattling so much on range with the shots and everything that it really distracted the heck out of me.
Yeah, it's not a stealth feature.
No, definitely not. I think that pretty much covers everything for the ergonomics, though. Not too... oh, wait, one last feature before I forget. We've got an extra feature here at the bottom that allows me to pop the
loading
M-block clip out.
Is an entirely different thing. So for those of you who haven't seen Montlicker episodes, you load the entire clip at once, and then you'd be able to cycle through your rounds from there. If you want to release it early, she has a button down there. Works pretty clear. So... which is an advantage. The M-block system is very unusual to me. How do you feel about these? So unfortunately, I'm not super keen on them because for me, it kind of needs to be very, very. I think the metal needs to be very strong. Like they need to be very resilient. And I don't know about you, man, but every time we get one of these, it just feels like they're so flimsy, that they're so susceptible to damage. And then the problem is that they stay in the guns, and they're going to be expunged out the bottom of this one in particular. Expelled, thank you. I keep saying expunged today. What is going on with me, guys? You've been watching too much of the legal stuff going on.
Probably. But no, yeah, that one pops out the bottom. I just feel like it's just too susceptible to damage for it to be that reliable of a system.
The funny thing about it is I actually really love the M-block system.
Gasp.
I find it to be faster loading than stripper clips. As long as...
it is. That is incredibly fast for loading. Y'all saw.
A poorly designed M-block is a pain to load. Mm-hmm. Or a worn out one. And I think that's what we're suffering from is a prejudice of age. Because these things have been around for 100 years plus. And we're using them over and over and over again, but the way they were designed to be used, it was to be completely disposable.
That's fair. And this one in particular, we did have some issues on range. Like, it seemed to want to be loaded one certain way in one gun versus another gun.
Yeah, because it's probably gotten worn out over the years.
Maybe you are correct. Maybe I have too much of a prejudice on that, and I'm thinking too much on it, and it's just worn, and that's just the only issue.
This singular 3-shot clip has probably fired maybe 100 rounds. Maybe more, we don't know.
I mean, we certainly put a few through it.
But mechanically, it was designed to fire 3.
It's true.
And that's the end. Maybe gather a few, reload them a couple times, but these were consumable.
And then consumable. They were essentially meant to drop at the bottom, and then you weren't really supposed to pick them up and reload them.
No, I mean, unless you're doing some sort of training, you know what I mean? You might, but then I don't think those would be reissued for fighting. So the problem is we have a particular prejudice in the modern era because we tend to think of disposable mags. And I even hear people talking about guns into the 70s and 80s and being surprised that the doctrine at the time, in very modern era, was you would empty rifle, pop mag, put empty mag in your pouch, pull new mag and load. Like this is British standard, way into the modern era.
True.
Because detachable box magazines are expensive and difficult to make in a very large number. And at some level, you have to transport them back and forth, and it's easier to transport raw ammo in those cases. And so there's all sorts of logistics in terms of when mags get loaded, how mags get shipped, right?
Fair.
When we're dealing with World War I technology in which, all of that sort of that steel forming that would be required for a disposable magazine, think of the guns we've dealt with. Almost none of them have disposable magazines or detachable magazines at all.
It's true.
And when they do,
very few do.
It's like the BAR. It has this very rigid, heavy magazine. Mm-hmm. The clip, the M-block clip, gives you every single benefit of the modern detachable disposable magazine, the kind where you're just like, you're in the middle of a firefight, you don't care where it lands, you don't have to worry about it afterwards, and the logistics of it are you can do that over and over and over again and never exhaust your raw materials. That's all here. So this is so low on material consumption and time consumption that you can discard millions of these in the middle of a fight, and it's never going to really matter because it's faster to just go ahead and load them and strip them out than it is to reload the little things. So they're brilliant in that regard in terms of enabling a soldier to work an antique rifle like a modern one. Stripper clips are the same way. You can just toss them aside.
That's true. You were supposed to.
The only problem with stripper clips for me personally is they are a bit more fiddly.
They can be.
And as much as I've practiced with one or the other, and people get fast with stripper clips, there's no argument there.
I mean, I can't argue that that wasn't rapid.
No, but if you get a stripper clip that has more tension or less tension or whatever else, they bind sometimes. There's some stripper clips that are friendly to you and some that aren't. You have your favorites, whatever. These just go into the action. And if they're a little tight or a little loose, that doesn't matter because you're ramming the bolt forward or back.
The only issue comes is if they're damaged, they just won't go into the action.
That's the issue. So these become the feed lips of the system. But we suffer the same problem with modern magazines.
This is true.
Unless it's very specifically a gun with its own integral feed lips, so like a Tokarev pistol.
Sure.
So there are other examples of that, and maybe you could design this to do the same thing. But I think the ultimate problems with the Mannlicher system really come down to its exposure to fouling, which we see solved on the Gewehr 8805, and we see it solved again on the M1 Garand later on. So I think N blocks are, to me, they're superior to stripper clips in some ways, and then obviously detachable magazine is superior to that, but the cost is very high. So, I don't know. I like these. They're fast, they're easy, but you are correct. They are fiddly as crap when they get to be 100 years old.
I think my issue is that I've just had so many fiddly ones in the past. I mean, we even had the RSC where it preferred one clip over the other. It absolutely did. It fed perfectly with one and just hated another. That was it.
I agree. And I think, but that again is one of those times where we might need to sort of understand the number of years that have gone into it.
I agree. I do agree. I will accept your assessment.
So how do you feel about, well, you know what, let's hold on to the number of rounds for a second. What's it like firing this gun?
All right, so first things first, I go to load my in-block clip, goes in just fine. I bolt forward, and I don't know about you, but something about this action just feels, it feels archaic. It did smoothly, like everything worked fine. It's just, it feels kind of clunky somehow and dated. I just can't explain it. But anyway, lining up my sights, and it kind of feels like I'm looking at buckhorn sights. It's interesting. There's like a swoop, and then it dips into a nice solid U-notch down there that I line in with my front sight, which is fine. I'm used to those for the buckhorns, but it's not quite a buckhorn. So it's
like a little tiny buckhorn. Yeah. It's weird. It's somewhere between a military sight and a buckhorn.
And I didn't find it hard to read necessarily. Like I didn't question where to line up. I mean, it just was different, I guess, than what I was expecting.
I could see it confusing a novice, though.
If they're not used to it, yes, sure, okay.
Yeah, so the subset U-notch to me, when you're trying to line up a front sight, and you always think about telling people how to shoot a pistol, you always want to say line up the top with the top. And
then if they decided to do that, I could understand why that would be confusing, because there's like two tops.
Right, there's that swoop that comes to sort of a soft edge. And
yeah, so it's almost like there's almost three tops in this situation where it's like, okay, so what is the top in this situation? In this case, it'd more be like put it in the bucket, almost.
Yeah. When you know how to shoot, you see it just fine. If you're a novice, I can see being a little confused about how to communicate how this sight looks.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. From there, pulling the trigger, it's not bad. There's like no take up. It feels like there's just practically nothing there. And then you hit a solid wall, and the brake was surprisingly clean. For how dated this action felt, I was surprised at how okay the trigger was. It wasn't amazing, it was just okay.
Yeah, it also has a very unique flat-shaped trigger. Did you notice that when you're working it?
To be fair, I don't really necessarily notice that off the bat when I'm shooting. The only thing that I tend to perceive is if there's some special notches to it. But I will say the trigger, being as straight and just as flat as it is, it does kind of feel dated as well when you just look at it and you feel it just off the bat. It doesn't really feel like a normal trigger, does it?
It feels kind of
smooth.
cheap.
It doesn't feel polished. It just feels like they stuck a piece of metal in there.
So the weird thing is, to me, I think the trigger feels cheap, right? I love it because I have larger hands and I might want to get lower on the trigger or higher on the trigger depending.
You know, that's true. You can just kind of pick your place on this one. There is a slight curve to it, by the way. It's not completely straight.
No. But some of the more aggressively like cupping triggers we've seen, especially in pistols, I've hated them because they wrap around my finger and they pinch it and it feels very odd.
Oh, you poor thing.
Like, but I actually prefer, weirdly, this sort of Lebel Berthier style flat trigger, which is really what it is, holdover from the Lebel.
Essentially, yeah.
So, okay, you've pulled the trigger.
Oh, God.
And I suppose this is where the magic happens.
Yeah, recoil on this one. So, if I'm just thinking, like, I just came off the Lebel, let's say, yeah, sure, 8mm Lebel from the Lebel, not too terrible. Yeah, it was not too bad. Then you put it in a carbine that is actually a fairly light carbine at that. And the weights to the rear, oh boy, oh my goodness, that was pretty substantial, even for me.
When they invented smokeless powder, the French were like, dump it all in there.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a screamer. It is a massive cartridge.
It definitely rocks you a little bit in this guy.
I find it's interesting, up until you pull the trigger, up until the bang, I find, other than the weird end block and cartridge count thing, I find this very comparable to some of the carbines we've really loved on this show. So, like, the Serbian was one of your favorites.
I can't argue with that because of the size and the weight. Right.
You like the Gewehr 88. Actually, this is very comparable to, like, the Carabiner 88. Very comparable to Carabiner 88. Except for the magazine capacity and then that recoil.
God, yeah. So, well, mag capacity aside, yeah, 3 rounds, that's never going to work. But the recoil, God, yeah, no, I mean, I remember shooting it the first time around, and I guess it just kind of, it's escaped me for what I was expecting when we were on range that day.
I wasn't going to remind her.
Yeah, it was pretty substantial, and by the end of the day, I was hurting just a little bit. But, yeah, no, I guess I'm glad there was only 3 rounds.
Yeah. 3 rounds out of this feels like 5 rounds out of the Gewehr 88, and maybe... Actually, I could get 6 rounds out of the Gewehr 88.
Yeah,
or the
probably
Carabiner 88. I keep screwing it up.
No, it's okay. I know what you're saying.
Yeah. It's very odd because they're right there with each other in terms of comparison. But there's just something about the recoil impulse of this gun and the heft of that cartridge.
Yeah, there's just so much kick to it.
Yeah, and to be fair, also, the Carabiner 88 we shot with the older, like, pre-S Patron cartridges.
That's true.
On this one, we shot a load much closer to World War I. However, that's what those sights are set up for.
Same load for, like, the Hotchkiss, essentially.
No, they're not quite as bad. Because there was a 1917 round, and I'm not really sure about the feet per second on that.
Okay.
But you got to remember, that has the updated sight for Ball M. So that's what we went with in terms of the load and blah, blah, blah. So there's more power coming out of that than our Carabiner 88, to my knowledge, off the top of my head. But... also, structurally, I feel like something about this gun is delivering recoil much more harshly, be it the lighter weight.
Yeah, it does feel like it's really climbing there. Yeah. I can't really put my finger on all of the pieces that probably add up that puzzle, but you are correct.
So, final difference between like those two guns, though, is this 3-shot capacity that we keep talking about gently.
Gently.
Yeah.
Have we talked about it gently?
How do you really feel about going into combat with exactly 3 shots before you have to reload?
Yeah, I'm not going to lie. I don't really have a lot of confidence with this because, I mean, it's 3 shots. And granted, so some of the pros for it. Okay, let me actually pro-con this. Pro-con. Pro, I can load it in quickly, and yeah, it's 3 rounds, so I can presumably stack a lot of these guys in my pockets. Like, I could see fitting these in a lot of spaces, even in girl jeans. Let's even go with that.
Okay, you're in battle in girl jeans.
Yeah, in battle in girl jeans. I can still fit these in a lot of girl jean pockets. I want to point that out. So, +1 there. And I can, you know what, it's great, it drops at the bottom, I pop in new ones, but the problem is I've still only got 3 rounds, which means that's going to take time to reload after my 3, which means I'm probably going to want to make my 3 shots really count.
Yeah, it is kind of uncomfortable to think that you're going to get 3 tries at something. I guess it's 3 strikes, you're out. I mean,
pretty much.
You get 3 tries at something and you better eat dirt and reload, which is... I don't know, maybe it encourages you to shoot and move.
Maybe it encourages me to take more time with my shots.
I'm not super confident about it. I'd rather have at least 5. I mean, minimum 5.
Yeah, I feel like 5 would be the upgrade for this one.
And I know we're saying that because other guns had 5. We're saying that because other guns had 5,
it's
but
true.
Also it feels like you want to spend as little time as possible manipulating the firearm while not fighting.
This is true.
So anytime you spend reloading, you don't spend on sights, you don't spend on trigger, you don't spend on hitting the enemy.
Yeah, it's basically less time away from the actual battle itself. It's less time defending, less time attacking, more time for me to get shot while being not ready.
Right. The ideal rifle would be one in which you can just pull the trigger and that's all you have to do. You aim, pull trigger, and do nothing else, because that means 100% of your attention is on the fighting. The problem with that is you must come up with mechanisms that accomplish this, the extra weight of carrying the ammunition on the rifle versus on the hip.
Right.
So then you get into these things where, like, the British had 10 rounds, but the Germans had 5 rounds, but the Italians had 6 rounds, but they're smaller. And so there's a lot of sort of debate on where that goes. Nowadays, we carry around smaller cartridges and lots of them, unless we have specialty rolls, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
So, this is something that's been sort of in debate for a very long time. This feels like one extreme of the debate that I can't really agree with.
I agree. I honestly, it's not a preferred amount of rounds. I'm going to go with that. It really does not inspire confidence in this gun for me.
So here comes the ultimate question then.
Oh boy.
How comfortable are you taking something like this into the war?
So, again, don't get me wrong. This performed well enough. We really didn't have any issues with it on range as far as functionality. Accuracy was okay with it. I can't really say it did anything that was an automatic like DQ in my book, as far as just it automatically was just not good enough. But the problem comes with, I know I've got better options out there. I've only got 3 rounds, and on top of that, this gun's pretty susceptible to mud and muck down here at the bottom. I don't know if we really mentioned
the top, too.
The top 2, yeah, actually, I do remember you talking about that. You can see
right through. I mean, look.
Yeah, I can actually, oh wow, yeah, you really can see.
No, the mechanism itself doesn't foul all that easily, so it's not like, it's interesting. The dearth of features on that bolt mean there's not a lot of things that bolt has to do, so it's fairly easy at shedding mud as much as it gains mud. However, the French did try to add a dust cover to this during the war, which means they knew that they were having problems with ingress.
Either was going to be or already was a problem. More than likely the latter.
Which is something we're actually talking about next episode. I just gave away some of the cat. But, I have a hard time with this gun because I really feel more confidently in it. It's so weird. In terms of shot for shot and not necessarily exhausting myself, I feel more confident in this than, say, futzing around with a Mosin, because you have to kind of get lucky on which Mosin you get.
This is true.
But Mosin has 5 shots.
Does have 5 shots.
Mosin doesn't even the Mosin carbines don't beat you up as much as this beats you up.
Also true, that recoil.
Yeah, and so, but also I prefer in block over stripper clip. So now I'm getting to a weird word. So
you're getting you're getting into the bit of the weird world with that. But honestly, I know there's better options. Is realistically what it boils down to. Could I take it into battle? Sure. Do I want to? Do I want to? Not really.
No, my morale would be pretty low.
Yeah, I wouldn't be super excited. I'd be like, oh boy, well, I don't like this. Like I'm looking at the label and I'm like, oh, it's not even really.
I'm glad this comes with a bayonet because I only get 3 shots.
Hooray. 3 strikes. Poke out.
Yeah, can you imagine, especially like close up, like in a trench work?
Oh God, that would be horrifying.
No, 3 shots and then, yeah, no, I'm good. I'll take 2 more, please. All right, so we've beaten up on the Berthier pretty well, but this isn't the end of its service in World War I. As a matter of fact, we see it much greater expanded in our next episode, and so you're going to see us talking about this all over again in 2 weeks' time.
So make sure you'll watch that.
If you're one of those future people, you can just click on the next video.
Lucky.
All right, have a good one.
Night, guys.
All right, gang, I know I left you with a little bit of a cliffhanger there, but don't have no fear, there'll be another episode, and you can always catch our behind-the-scenes podcasty things going on over at our Patreon and our Subscribestar. In this case, I want to make very clear that I had 2 big helpers on this episode. Number 1, of course, Mr. Ian Mccollum lent us not only some reading material, but his images, which was very, very nice of him. Again, those are all tagged out for Chassepot to Famas, which is a beautiful book that I'm told you can't even buy anymore, so good luck, suckers. Now, number 2, and very importantly,
For a while now, I've been receiving emails, and a lot of them having very wonderful attachments in original French documents. Back when we did the first Berthier episode, we had someone contact us by the name of Ludovic Bertrand, and I'm sorry if I'm messing up your name, Ludovic. But he got really curious about this whole Berthier disparity, the idea that André Berthier was 2 men or 1 man, the whole argument around it. So he ran down the documentation and put it together very nicely, and it appears that, yes, it is actually 1 person, which makes a lot more sense. He got us the military records as best he could. Beautiful job. So thank you again, my friend, for really clearing this up for everybody. All right, everybody have a good one. Leave a note of thanks for our good friends in the comments, and stay safe out there.